Hello, you're very welcome to the Middle East Teaching and Learning Conference 2020. My name's Dr. Andy Hogg and I'm from the Support School UK. I'm the director of the Support School, which is a consultancy which offers support to international schools for teaching kids who have additional needs, both in terms of their EAL language, but also special educational needs as well. My background has gone from mainstream education to special education and up into leading staff teams both in SEN departments and ESL departments in international schools in several countries across the world. And the talk today here is to really get you thinking and hopefully considering what inclusion looks like in your schools. And undoubtedly there are some possibilities, but there are undoubtedly some problems as well that are involved or surround that issue as well. But we're going to look at them today anyway. Okay, so our first outcomes first. We want to stimulate the thought and dialogue amongst you people as the leaders and change makers in education. You're the ones who can make this happen. If it isn't already happening, you're the ones who can develop this if it is already happening in your school. And some people will be quite honest about this and say that they want to be seen as an inclusive school. Some people will be quite honest and say they don't want to be. They want to be academically selective. Hopefully we can kind of change some of those minds today in the presentation that we have for you. So we want you to consider how you can affect full inclusion, or certainly work towards full inclusion in your school. It doesn't have to be as problematic as you might think. And I want to pull you back to this quote here from Mittler, who says, and this is a quote I focused on throughout my own research, is that inclusion is a vision. It is a road to be travelled, but a road without ending, and a road with all kinds of obstacles, some of them invisible, some of them in our own heads and hearts. And I want you to hold on to that one and think about it as we move through the presentation, because an awful lot of the problems in affecting inclusion or moving down that road towards full inclusion certainly do come from our heads, probably more so than our hearts. But certainly from our heads, and we're going to talk about that. It might sound a little bit uncomfortable, but please just bear with us and hold on to that quote. It's very important. Okay, so what is inclusion then? Well, everyone probably has an idea at this stage. It's about everyone. It's about culture, religion, disability, language, ethnicity, gender. I mean, it's all here, isn't it? But fundamentally, in international schools, some of the most important things are skill sets. Do we have a skill set in our school that will allow us to enable us to accept kids on this inclusion agenda? Attitudes is the biggest one. Again, my own research pulled this out, that the biggest barrier to inclusion is attitudes. It's not anything else. You can fall back and suggest that financial barriers are there, but in international education, very often, the money probably is there somewhere or could be made available from somewhere to help you move towards that idea that you're going to be a fully inclusive school. The other word I want to pull you to on here is prejudice. People don't like that word, but very often I think it's a word you have to consider when you put a barrier up towards inclusion. Why are you putting that barrier up? Do you not believe in education for all? As an educator across the world, people who are embracing different cultures, why would we put a barrier up towards some kids coming to our school if we can make the changes and the adaptations that we need to our schools, to our curriculums, to our staff that we need to in order to include all? And sometimes it's not just about the international communities, maybe it may be about including the local communities in your school as well. It doesn't just have to be about those fee-paying expats. There are more people around your school community than just those who pay, and maybe you can begin to include some of them as well. Okay, the first questions I want you to think about: do you have an aspiration to achieve inclusion in your school? Because if you don't, then I want you to think about why. We want our schools to reflect society. And society is multifaceted. We have different skin colours, different ethnicities, different religions, different age groups, different genders. Why would we not want to reflect society in our schools? The other thing is, and this is really important in an international school context, are you one of those schools that trades on the idea that you develop future leaders and decision makers? Because if you do, then I think that that second point there about your school reflecting society is even more crucial, because we need our schools to reflect society if we're going to produce the best leaders for the future and the decision makers of our world. So if you're trading on that idea, then I certainly think that inclusion is something you really need to think long and hard about. This is the Inclusion Report 2020, just come out from the International School Research and Next Frontier Inclusion. The revised definition of inclusion in international school is that it's inclusive when it's made the intentional decision to develop diverse student and faculty populations that reflect society as a whole. So it's just what I've just been saying. We have multilingual learners. That's really quite easy in an international school, surely. And students with diverse learning profiles. That's probably the area that a lot of schools kind of struggle with at the moment, I think. But these schools who are inclusive take a systems approach to building capacity amongst stakeholders, offering universal design and aspects to all of school life. A really valuable asset to have in your school, to say it's inclusive, but always questioning how inclusive, how can we evidence that inclusion in our school. Okay, so we have three schools, three international schools here I'm going to talk to you about. When we talk about inclusion, are they just words? Is inclusion just tokenism? Really, it's about being honest, and I think schools, we talk about our teachers being reflective practitioners. As school leaders, we need to be honest and we need to reflect on what we actually offer in our schools as well. The first international school group, and I spoke to these people, they say that they align with science and technology, with culture and the arts, and with love and charity. Great words. Great words. They spend a lot of the year fundraising for an orphanage, and they make sure that they go to that orphanage with a couple of iPads every year and take some photographs and put them on their website and say that they're doing great things for the community, which is all very well. But I had a conversation with a senior leader at this school, quite senior management within the foundation that owns the school actually. And I asked them what about if we have kids with disabilities coming to the school, and that person's face just dropped. And I was told, I was quite astounded by this, that they wouldn't accept them. Now this is a school group that's aligning with science and technology. So they're saying that they align with that as long as it doesn't mean putting a ramp up so someone can get in with a wheelchair to their school. They align with science and technology as long as it's not going to cost them to put an elevator into the school so that students could access all 3 floors. They talk about love and charity, which is there until you want to come to our school, and then really we don't really have enough love to accept you into our school. So these are the kind of honest conversations or evaluations I want schools to kind of think about. The next school then, another very big and well-to-do international school, again I know quite well. Our strength is built on relationships that embrace diversity. Means listening with empathy and communicating kindly. Yet at admissions, they use a battery of tests at the admission stage that prevent kids getting into the school because they want to be academically selective. They do very well at a great school academically, but in terms of inclusion, these are just words because they're not doing anything towards inclusion at all. We want to build that, and actually what they're doing is they're putting barriers up saying, no, you're not the right kid for our school. This isn't the right place for you. We're academically selective. So I don't really think that they're embracing diversity at all. They're actually putting barriers up to that. The third school then, and probably the second paragraph here is what I'm looking at here, is that they nurture their members to become globally minded citizens. And this goes back to what I was saying before about future leaders. How can you nurture someone to be a globally minded citizen when your school does not embrace diversity of disabled students? If you're putting barriers up at your admission stage to stop them coming in, if you're making excuses for why you can't make your school accessible, then how can you nurture globally minded citizens? Because you keep them at arm's length. This idea that you fundraise for a local orphanage and you take some photographs that makes your school look great on its website, look what we're doing for these poor kids or these kids with disabilities. There's much more you can do on a daily basis, believe you me, and we're going to look at that later as well. Okay, so inclusive schools are diverse problem-solving organisations. They really are, and that's something to be proud of, I think. That if you're an inclusive school, there's a lot more to be proud of than just having an academic record that says you're great. The inclusion of all, creating those societies that reflect the world in your school, not just academically gifted societies, is to be embraced and applauded as well. Okay, so international school inclusion checklist. What do we do in international schools? Well, the first thing is we have lots of different cultures, don't we? I think we do culture quite well in international schools. We celebrate Eid, Chinese New Year, we celebrate Christmas, Diwali. So in terms of culture, there's probably quite a lot that goes on that we do quite well in school. Religion's another one that within reason, religion and culture are quite closely tied, our festivals. So yeah, religion, we'll probably tick that and say that we do quite well in terms of culture and religion. Language, well, obviously, international schools, we have a multitude of languages. We all have a common language as well in terms of speaking English. So let's tick that box as well. And then we get down to this one, disability. And this is the elephant in the room, really, isn't it? Disability. What do we have in our schools that allows us to take kids who have disabilities, intellectual or physical disabilities, into our schools? Are we doing that? And this is the big question mark for us. I go back to that school, the first one on the previous slide that I talked about, who told me that a kid with a wheelchair couldn't come into their school. What about this kid in the wheelchair? I'm sure some of you recognise him. Dr. Stephen Hawkins, in his undergraduate days, of course, in better health than he was towards the end, but he was in a wheelchair. So this school I told you about would actually stop him coming to their school simply because he's in a wheelchair. They wouldn't put ramps up, they wouldn't put the provision in of access around the school for elevators to enable him to access the school facilities on the site, on the school site. So would a wheelchair be a barrier to getting into your school? Because if it would, then you really have to question whether you're an inclusive school. Something as simple as that. And you also have to look at yourself and say, how many able-bodied students do you have on your roll at the moment that would make the impact on the world that Stephen Hawkins made? So if you put up barriers towards people in wheelchairs coming into your school, then you're effectively putting a barrier up towards having potentially the next Stephen Hawkins in your school. That's what we're looking at here, and that's one of these things. As I say, inclusion is about evaluation. It's about self-reflection. What are we doing? How can we best affect it? Already, I can hear you saying, but inclusion is very difficult. I'm not sure who else is doing it. Well, the inclusion report for 2020 that comes from ISC Research, Next Frontier Inclusion, has just come out. Actually, I got a forward copy of this that I'm able to include some of the results of it in this presentation. And yeah, a lot of the results are very similar to what was achieved in the 2016-2017 report that they did. But there are a greater percentage of international schools now who are identifying that they're at the beginning of that journey towards inclusion. They're interested in what other schools are doing. They want to learn more. Are you one of those schools? Do you want to be one of those schools? A lot more international schools are starting to identify that they have students with mental health or emotional conditions that require interventions. There's an increase of 6% of international schools who serve students with special needs, primarily in the mainstream classroom with learning specialists supporting that in terms of IEPs and things. Since the first administration in 2016 of the inclusion report, there's been a decline in the students with high intellectual gifts in the populations. So perhaps that provision, whilst I would say we can't ignore it because that's part of what inclusion's about, we need to focus our resources and maybe look further down the inclusion ladder and say, well, okay, perhaps the kids with more profound disabilities, intellectual and physical, are the kids we need to be looking at developing provision for within our school. A lot of schools reporting that children with learning needs are served entirely by qualified educators as well. Children with learning needs are not just being bumped out to a learning support specialist. They are actually starting to be educated with their peers, which obviously is fantastic in terms of inclusion, and we'll look at that as we move through the presentation in the next few slides as well. And obviously we have a lot of students where we have that EAL and learning support grey area. Is this a language problem? Is it a learning support problem? Lots of schools having difficulty in deciding which that is there as well. Another quote at the bottom from Alex Widdowson from earlier on this year, January the 15th, that society can be measured by its capacity to nurture those who are most vulnerable. Have we got that kind of society in our schools? Okay. The Salamanca Statement in 1994 is where the inclusion agenda really was kicked into the mainstream educational psyche, I guess, for people to start thinking about. If you don't know anything about Salamanca, very quickly, it was a game changer for inclusive education. It defined the rights of the child. Participating countries agreed to adopt inclusive education. There were 300 delegates, 92 countries, 25 international organisations represented there as well. There was kick-started a global movement recognising the rights of the child and the validation that inclusion was the expectation and not the aspiration for education. Okay, so before that it was kind of like, well, you know, we can't really do it, but now we're starting to see through Salamanca, people are starting to say we need to be thinking about making sure our schools are inclusive and reflect society. One of the things about Salamanca is that it comes from a meeting of the United Nations, and the United Nations is very much endorsed in the international school community when people are taking on the model United Nations that they promote to develop the leaders of tomorrow who can argue and see both sides of an argument. But are they happy to take that and promote that? But are they not paying attention to what the United Nations says on inclusive education? Are we not committing to ensure we have diverse school communities that reflect our societies? Are we being tokenistic towards inclusion? I don't know. Again, it's one of those questions you have to ask in your own self-reflection about how inclusive your school is. Again, any inclusion has to be at the heart of a society. Diversity, fraternity, equality of opportunity are all important, and we need to be promoting that if we are truly educating the leaders of tomorrow, if that's the kind of leaders that we're going to be producing. We want communities to reflect that. This is the actual Salamanca statement in 1994. Again, the first paragraph is very much about, you know, access to education. And this second one is the one that I think is most important. The most effective means of combating discriminatory attitudes are by creating welcoming communities, building an inclusive society, and achieving education for all. That is what I say when I'm talking about schools that educate the leaders of tomorrow. Well, this is what we need to be promoting. We need to be making our schools inclusive and reflective of society if we're going to combat those discriminatory attitudes. So people are going to say, but what's the benefits of inclusion? You know, mainstream students, what do they get from it? Well, you know, it's about partnership, it's about collaboration, it's about the opportunity for mainstream students to experience what having a disability is like, a physical or intellectual disability. What it's like to support someone who's got a physical or intellectual disability. What it's like to engage in sports with someone with a physical or intellectual disability. We never provide those opportunities for the kids on a day-to-day basis where it becomes normal. We might do it, say tokenism again. We might take them out and deliver them to the local special school, the local orphanage, and they might, you know, do that for a day or for a few hours. But what we really want is to experience it on a day-to-day. That's how we develop attitudes. That's how we promote empathy, the kind of emotional literacy that we want our students to have if they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. You can see here, this comes from the Opening Doors, Opening Minds document 2006 from the National College of School Leadership in the UK. where they were exploring co-location as a route to inclusion. We'll talk about co-location later. But this was these were some quotes from some of the students in a mainstream school that had been co-located with a special school. So there was an integration on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis with kids from a special school as well. And you can see here, it's incredibly positive. The mainstream students really embraced this and they enjoyed it as well. It made their school more real. And look at that, you get to become more tolerant of other people. You get a better experience of what it's going to be like in the real world. I think that in itself is enough reason to affect inclusion as far as you can in your schools. It really, really is important. Who wouldn't want to live in a world tomorrow if it was like that? So, the benefits for the disabled students then, obviously again from the same document, Opening Doors, Opening Minds. These were some of the quotes that were collected from the special education students. And it's very much about acceptance. It's very much about developing friendships. I mean, if you've never worked in special education before, perhaps you don't appreciate it. If you've no experience of someone in your family who has a disability, perhaps you've no experience of what it's like to be socially isolated. These kids go to school, go home, and are kept at home because there's no one to play with, because there's nowhere to go. And these kids don't get to develop friendships with peers of their own age. They never get included or asked out to some of the functions that the other kids get to. So it's incredibly important for them, and there's a huge amount of quotations there from the students in special schools there that give another thumbs up to this sort of inclusive model of co-location. So how would this work in your school? Well, for mainstream students, obviously, they have an experience of working alongside peers whose life experience is very different to theirs. Again, empathy, understanding. We talk about future leaders. I've talked about the need to understand all sections of society and that meaningful daily interaction rather than tokenism. The disabled students, they're no longer socially isolated. They're socially integrated all of a sudden. They have peers the same age. The problems and challenges that disabled students have are recognised by mainstream students. They understand them. They understand those perspectives and the challenges. The disabled students have a chance to participate in mainstream settings, to be normal kids with mainstream peers, perhaps even with their siblings as well. I mean, how many families from expat communities actually have children, their siblings are split because one has a disability and can't be educated at the local school. So the opportunity here is to provide provision that allows families to be educated together as well. And changing mindsets, it's not just about changing mindsets in the people who are going to make this decision about whether you move towards full inclusion, but changing mindsets for the disabled students as well. Because they believe in special education settings sometimes that this is the limit for them, this is all they can do. The opportunity to integrate with mainstream changes their mindset to more of a can-do for themselves as well. So it has a really positive impact on the disabled students as well as the mainstream students in your school. A leader is someone who demonstrates what's possible. So are you that kind of leader who can demonstrate that full inclusion is possible with the right support and a lot of other things as well in place, but as I say, we'll talk about them. This is to stimulate your thought processes. How close to full inclusion can you get? So how would this work for your school? Well, for the teaching staff, there's an opportunity to develop additional skills here, particularly in those areas of differentiation and understanding the process of learning at very early stages, building up into our mainstream curriculums as well. Perhaps there's the opportunity for them to work with special colleagues so they can design curriculum particularly for special education kids as well. Understanding and appreciating students in both contexts makes better teachers. So is that the kind of teacher that you want? Do you want to offer that provision to your teachers so they can grow and they feel they can grow? I mean, for the school itself, yes, you would need probably some additional provision as well. And there might be in the long term some income benefits from that. I don't know. It would depend. But certainly a move towards full inclusion is where this would go. You're going to produce students who are globally minded, have empathy, have the life understanding that people's lives are different. And we have highly skilled teachers who can meet all needs as well. Again, because they've developed this understanding of differentiation and a desire to meet needs as well, so that they can break things down and make them accessible for students with very diverse learning needs. Okay then, so the colocation model of inclusion is certainly the one I would advocate for international schools. Basically, it means you've got two schools on one site, so you remove that problem of transportation from one site to another when you're trying to affect inclusion in those classrooms. So there could be shared areas of the school, things like the dining room, the sports hall, certainly your staff room, because you want your staff from both settings to mix so that they feel that collegiality, that they are part of the one staff team, and that you're not there and we're not here, and we're kind of disconnected in some way. So there are certainly areas that you need to think about if you're going to share them. But there are opportunities for both sets of students to cross into the other part of the school, and certainly in early years, if you've got soft play areas, light rooms, hydrotherapy rooms, those younger kids are going to love that. Some of the older kids are going to love it as well. The idea that they can go and chill out in these places, relax in them before their studies. The additional provision that's on site can be used 12 months of the year, but it's going to benefit everyone in the school. The other thing about this is that your extracurricular program, developing things like Makaton, sign language, paraverbal communication strategies in dealing with kids who potentially are non-verbal. But you're going to be able to offer that to your mainstream kids as a skill that they can learn, that they're going to leave school with. Wow. If we learn all these different communication strategies, not just languages that we speak, but languages that we can talk with our hands and use our paraverbal communication the same way, it's certainly going to enhance the school experience for our mainstream students too. Opportunities for both sets of students to cross into the other part of the school, as I say. You're going to have some seriously skilled SEND staff. When we talk about seriously skilled, experienced, we're talking about certainly there, who have skills in the areas that you particularly want to develop your provision in. As I say, the additional provision is certainly going to enhance your mainstream provision too. Okay, so there are problems and challenges. Nobody's going to hide away from that fact, that when we talk about developing a fully inclusive school model, there are some serious problems and challenges. As we spoke before, and we go back to our first quote from Mittel, is that hearts and minds are very often where some of our attitudes are, and they're the biggest barriers to it. Those closed mindsets to full inclusion. Well, we can't do it, we're not going to do it. So there it goes, it's parked there and we don't do it. We're academically selective. It's interesting from the Inclusion Report 2020 to note that actually fewer schools are becoming academically selective. And the reason is that they recognise the benefits of full inclusion. We've got an increase in schools who want to affect inclusion and a decrease in those who now are going to say that they are purely academically selective. Some of the attitudes that it costs too much, or that we just don't have the staff on site. Well, again, cost, perhaps that's something that can be financed in other ways. And skilled staff on site, well, you can always recruit skilled staff. That's something that you build to. No one's expecting a magic wand to be waved and this to happen overnight. It's a journey that you're on. It takes time, and it's built into your school development plan as well. And there you go. As leaders, you can manage that change and be effective at implementing new initiatives as well. So finance then, obviously planning is required. Vision is required by the leaders as well. Where is this going to go? We've got to put these plans into our school development plan. It's probably going over 3 or 5 years. We need to retain in the short term the staff that are going to get us to that point where we have this available on site, and as we're going to develop the provision in the way that we want it to develop. So finance is certainly something that we need to consider as well. But if you're an effective leader, perhaps you can convince the stakeholders that this is right, and this can really enhance your school's reputation and the provision that it offers. Then there's that horrible word at the end, prejudice again. And we hear people say, oh, we don't need this cohort of students. Well, it's not something that we could ever consider. And again, going back to that first slide where I told you about one of the first school who'd said that they just wouldn't accept a kid in a wheelchair. I mean, that kind of prejudice really needs to be challenged. People really need to think about that. And if that's something that you feel, then perhaps you need to talk to someone on inclusion and see how inclusion can work in your context. I think if you're happy to hide behind that as an educator, then I don't really think that you belong as an educator in the 21st century. I think, challenges are abound in education, and we've had many this year already. I'm not denying that at all. But certainly in terms of inclusion, Salamanca's been around since '94. If you haven't started on that inclusion journey, if it's something that you're new at, your school's new to, then I certainly think it's something that really in the 21st century you need to be thinking about. Remember that innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower there. Steve Jobs pops up. He had to come in somewhere, didn't he? But obviously, again, this is about leadership. The problems and challenges can be managed by effective leaders. And I believe that there are lots of effective leaders in international education with such diverse workforces that some of the challenges of inclusion really can be removed. The obstacles that are in our hearts and our heads can be removed. And that the obstacles that are in other people's hearts and heads can be removed by really effective and innovative leaders. So where do you begin if you're going to start implementing inclusion in any level, I guess, even if you think that you're an inclusive school now? An inclusion audit is the first place you need to start. You really need to look at what provision you've got in place and what your policy says about inclusion right now. What skills have you got on site at the moment to help you achieve the model of inclusion that you would like to work towards? As I say, it involves that planning process. And not just about disability either. I mean, there are all areas of inclusion. We're focusing on disability today because that's a huge area of contention about developing co-location. But, disability, ethnicity, religion, gender, age, any of those things, areas of inclusion, need to be identified when you're doing an audit as well. It's not just about disability. Obviously, your inclusion audit is going to identify those gaps in your provision and the areas where you can say, right, maybe we need to plan towards that, and we start to develop inclusion in those areas first that we've already identified in our planning and in our provision that we have on site at the moment and our school development plan. Obviously, planning and auditing identifies costs that you're going to have to meet and how can they be met, and you can start to focus on the development of the school over your school development plan lifetime, and that's 3 years or 5 years. And obviously implementing plans to develop the model you've identified that best fits your school. Again, remembering to remove the obstacles from our own heads and hearts. So, finally, looking at a little quote there from George David, a quote on every slide, I think. We love inclusion, so I do like to throw ideas out there. This isn't just me banging a drum. There are lots of people, great people out there, who talk very passionately about inclusion, George Day being another one. That inclusion isn't about bringing people into what already exists. It's about making a new space, a better space for everyone. And I think as leaders in schools, as we look at the provision that we have now, which is probably quite well resourced in mainstream in most international schools and international school groups, that we do begin to make a better space for everyone. And that co-location model would work for an awful lot of international schools if you developed it over a period of time with the right plans, the right audits, and the right aspiration, innovation, and a can-do attitude that removes those obstacles in your head and your heart. Many schools in the Middle East have already started this in the last few years. Qatar Foundation, schools in the Saudi Arabia, the multinational schools group, many schools in Dubai as well are already starting to develop these co-location models. They have huge benefits, and I believe that there's the opportunity to do that a lot more in many more schools across the Middle East and the wider international school community. So hopefully today we've opened up your mind a little bit to inclusion, how to develop it or implement it to a greater degree within your school in the context, particularly in the context of disability in international schools today. Remember, inclusion involves a broad range of areas, and you don't want to sacrifice one area in favour of developing another aspect of inclusion. So when we're focusing particularly on disability, that's not to say that we're not ignoring our obligations towards inclusion on grounds of race, ethnicity, culture, gender, age, and everything else there. It really is important to not lose the focus or divert it. It's a broad focus when we're talking about inclusion. And remember that there's huge benefits for society and education in moving towards full inclusion. The leaders of tomorrow need to relate to the people they lead. There's no better place to embed that experience than within a school, because if you don't do it in their school, you can be sure that it probably isn't going to happen at any other time of their life. We need to embed those attitudes early on, and school is the ideal place to do that. I think we've tried to cover quite a lot in the space of 25 to 30 minutes, and we could go on for much longer and in much greater depth many of these ideas. If you'd like to send me a question in the app, of course, please do so. I'll be more than happy to get back and respond to that. And if you can't manage it in the app, then obviously you can always look us up and contact us through the email, through the support school. We would very much like to meet some of you, maybe even work with some of you in the future as well. I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. I certainly have. It's one of my passions, and thanks very much for taking the time to attend today.